Good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the hour happens to be, welcome. Pull a blanket over yourself if you have one nearby. Dim the lights a little if you can. Let your shoulders drop the 2 inches they have probably been holding since sometime this morning. You do not need to do anything else tonight. You do not need to follow along closely, or remember names, or catch every detail as it passes. The only task in front of you now is rest, and I will handle the rest of the work, which is simply to carry you somewhere far away from here. We are going to Tehran, not the Tehran of glass towers and traffic you might picture, if a modern photograph is the only one you have ever seen, but an older city, walled and low and golden at center, where a royal palace sits behind high gates and turquoise tile glows under a hard, bright desert sun. Somewhere inside those gates, in a set of rooms lined with mirrored glasswork and carved plaster, a young woman is sitting with an inkwell in front of her, writing something she does not expect anyone else alive to ever read. Her name was Taj al-Sultana, Crown of the Kingdom, if you translate the title plainly, though titles like that meant far less to her than you might think. She was a princess of the Qajar dynasty, daughter of one of the most powerful men in 19th century Persia, and for more than 100 years after her death, almost nobody outside her own family knew her name at all. Her private pages sat folded away and unread until long after she was gone. When they finally surfaced, they did something no royal portrait and no gilded miniature had ever managed. They told the truth about a life the outside world had only ever guessed at. That is where we are headed tonight. Behind the fountains and the tile work, into the actual hours of one single day inside a Persian royal household, the small labors and the small comforts, the silk and the loneliness, both. I suspect you will find it a gentler story than you expect, and also a far more honest one. There is no need to hold on to any of it as we go. Friend, let your eyes close whenever they want to. I will still be here, talking quietly, long after you have drifted off. So get comfortable, breathe out slowly, and let us begin in the sun-warmed shade of a palace courtyard in the last years of the old Persian court. Tonight we are going to follow Taj al-Sultana through one representative day inside the royal court of Qajar, Persia, somewhere around the year 1901. That is our subject, plainly stated. Not a legend and not a museum placard, but a day, hour by hour, inside a household that most people in the West have never had explained to them with any real honesty. Because there is already a version of this story living in your head, whether you asked for it or not. If you have spent any time online, there is a decent chance you have seen it. A portrait of a 19th century Persian princess circulates every so often, usually with a joke attached, some line about beauty standards being so strange back then that a woman with a faint mustache and heavy joined eyebrows. It gets shared for a laugh, a little chuckle at how different their taste must have been, how peculiar the past was, how funny history can be when you only look at it sideways. The version you probably carry in your mind is almost entirely wrong. Not because the woman in that image was invented, she was real, and her face was her own. But the joke strips away everything that made her a person, and what is left behind is a caricature, standing in for an entire world she actually lived inside, thought about carefully, and eventually wrote about in devastating detail. Taj al-Sultana was not a punchline. She was a working intellectual trapped inside a court system built specifically to prevent educated women from having any outlet for that intellect. And she wrote her way past the silence anyway, at night, by candlelight, in a memoir nobody was ever supposed to read. The real version does not erase the strangeness of that world. If anything, it widens it. Behind the palace's turquoise gates lived a system of royal marriage, veiled seclusion, and inherited rank that would strike most modern viewers as almost unimaginable. Girls married at ages that would horrify us now. Wives and daughters organized by status inside a walled women's quarter called the Anderon, a household within a household governed by its own rules and its own quiet hierarchies. Education handed out unevenly, depending on whether a father happened to notice his daughter was clever, and whether noticing it mattered to him at all. Taj noticed everything around her. She wrote about corridors and coal pots and court gossip, certainly, but she also wrote about her own mind. Straining against the walls of that life, wanting an education she was denied, wanting a public voice she was denied, wanting to matter for something other than her bloodline and her face. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening that suits you, settling in with history that feels like a place you can actually stand inside rather than a fact you memorized once for a test, I would be grateful if you took a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel find more people who want exactly this kind of company at night. If you are willing, tell me in the comments where you are listening from this evening and what time it happens to be where you are. I read every one of them, and there is something quietly moving about knowing how far these stories travel while all of you are supposedly falling asleep. Wherever you happen to be tonight, friend, I am glad of the company. By the time tonight's story is finished, I think the meme will look different to you. Not shameful, exactly. Just small. Small next to the actual size of the life it was cut out of. So let us set the internet aside entirely for a while. No feeds, no captions, no jokes passed between strangers. Only the palace, the year 1901, and a household somewhere inside it that is just beginning to wake. It is the year 1901, early autumn, in the city of Tehran. Tehran, in this era, is not yet a city of boulevards. It is enclosed, literally, by a great earthen wall raised only 2 decades earlier at the old Shah's command. 12 gates set into it at intervals, each one tiled in yellow and blue with lions and suns worked into the glaze, each one closed and guarded after dark. Locals know these gates by name rather than number. The Dowlat Gate facing east toward the seat of government, the Kazvin Gate opening west along the caravan road toward the Caspian provinces, the Shemeran Gate leading north into the foothill villages where wealthier families keep summer gardens to escape the worst of the capital's heat. Each gate closes at a fixed hour after sunset, and a traveler caught on the wrong side of one after dark simply waits until morning, since no amount of station or hurry persuades a gatekeeper to reopen a bolted door before its appointed time. Beyond the wall, the plain stretches out flat and pale toward the north, and beyond that plain, the Alborz Mountains rise up sudden and enormous, their upper slopes already carrying the season's first thin dusting of snow. Anyone standing on a rooftop terrace in the late afternoon can watch the light change on those peaks, pink, then gray, then a cold blue that seems to come from nowhere at all. Inside the walls, the streets are narrow and unpaved, hard-packed dirt in the dry months, ankle-deep mud whenever it rains. Most houses turn a blank mud brick face toward the street, no windows at eye level, because a Persian house of any standing keeps its real life hidden behind an inner courtyard the passerby will never see. From outside, Tehran looks almost featureless. Wall after wall, gate after gate, the color of the earth itself. It is only once you pass through a doorway that the city reveals what it has been hiding. A courtyard with a pool at its center, fruit trees along the walls, tile work in blues and turquoise that catches whatever light manages to fall into that private square of sky. The air carries a dozen smells at once. By mid-morning, wood smoke and dung smoke rising from 100 kitchen fires. Fresh bread, flat and blistered, pulled hot from clay ovens sunk into the ground, sold from trays balanced on the heads of boys weaving through foot traffic. The mineral sharpness of the quanats, the underground water channels that bring snowmelt down from the mountains and surface here and there in open pools, giving the whole city, even in a dry climate, a faint, constant smell of wet stone. Dust, always dust, fine and pale, settling on eyelashes and eyebrows by noon. And underneath everything else, the animal smell of a working city, mules and horses, and the occasional camel train just arrived from Kazvin or Qom, their bells clattering long before you can see them. The sounds are just as layered. The call to prayer rolls out 5 times across the rooftops from a dozen different minarets at once, never quite synchronized, so the whole city seems to murmur with itself for several minutes each time. Underneath that, the ordinary noise of commerce, the metallic ring of coppersmiths in the bazaar hammering out trays and pots, the creak of wooden cartwheels, vendors calling out the price of melons or pomegranates in long musical phrases that carry for a surprising distance in the thin, dry air. Somewhere, always a dog barks at something only it can see. Somewhere else, children's voices rise and fall in a game that has probably not changed in a century. Camel trains matter more to this city's rhythm than their brief mention deserves. Caravans arriving from Kazvin, from Qom, from as far as Mashhad or the Caspian coast, thread through the northern gates on a rotating schedule. The whole city has learned to read without needing anything written down, merchants timing their own errands around whichever caravan happens to be due, since a fresh caravan means fresh goods in the bazaar and tar. Just as often, fresh news carried by drivers who have spent weeks on the road hearing things travelers hear. A camel driver, newly arrived from the north, might mention, almost in passing, a rumor about soldiers near the Caucasus border, or a poor harvest reported from a village 3 days out, and within a day that same rumor will have traveled, reshaped a little with each retelling, all the way through the bazaar and eventually softened and filtered into the palace itself. By late afternoon, whatever the season, the light over Tehran takes on a quality travelers from wetter countries always seem to remark on in their letters home. A hard clarity that makes distant objects, a minaret, a mountain ridge, a line of poplar trees along a kanat, look closer than they actually are. Dust that hung suspended and golden through the middle of the day begins to settle, and for a short window before dusk fully arrives, the whole city seems briefly washed clean, rooftops and domes catching a warm coppery light that will be gone again within 20 minutes, replaced by the blue, then violet, then finally black of a high desert evening. By the time the sun has fully cleared the eastern rooftops, the streets already carry the specific rhythm of a working morning. Water carriers move from house to house with skins slung over their shoulders, refilling household cisterns before the heat sets in. Women from poorer households, veiled in plain, dark chador, hurry toward the bakeries with a coin or two clutched in one hand, timing their trip for the moment the ovens finish their first batch. Mule trains loaded with charcoal or firewood pick their way down streets barely wide enough for 2 animals to pass, their drivers calling out warnings in a sing-song that pedestrians have learned to answer without even looking up. Somewhere near the bazaar gates, a scribe has already set up his low writing desk for the day, ready to draft letters for anyone who cannot write one themselves, which in this era is most of the city. Above all of it, cutting through the mule bells and the vendor calls, comes the muezzin's second call of the morning, and for a few minutes the ordinary noise of the street quiets almost to nothing while men pause where they stand. An ordinary laborer in this Tehran, a porter or a bricklayer, earns something in the range of 2 or 3 kirans a day, paid at the end of a long physical shift. A loaf of the flatbread that feeds most households costs a fraction of a kiran. A room to rent in a poor quarter of the city might run a family a few tomans a month, a toman being worth roughly 10 kirans, and most families in that position are stretching every kiran as far as it will possibly go, the way working families everywhere have always had to. It is a city where wealth is visible mostly by its absence from most streets and its concentration behind a small number of very specific gates. Nearly everything worn or eaten inside those specific gates begins its life somewhere in the bazaar just outside them. The covered bazaar of Tehran is itself a kind of second city, a maze of vaulted brick corridors lit by shafts of dusty sunlight falling through openings in the roof, organized by trade the way it has been for centuries. The silk merchants cluster in one corridor, the coppersmiths in another, the spice sellers somewhere else entirely, their stalls perfumed with saffron, dried limes, and sacks of cumin stacked shoulder high. Deeper in, past the leatherworkers and the carpet dealers, sit the embroiderers, hunched over frames stretched with silk, working gold and silver thread into patterns that will eventually travel, finished, through the palace gates to become part of a court costume nobody in the bazaar will ever personally see worn. It is worth remembering, as we go, that every thread of silk inside those royal apartments passed through hands like these. First, hands belonging to people whose own lives looked nothing like the ones their work would eventually decorate. One of those gates belongs to the royal quarter. The Kolistan Palace complex sits near the heart of the old city, a walled compound within the walled compound of Tehran itself. Layers of privacy stacked one inside another like a nested bot. Passing through its gates is passing into another climate entirely, or so it can feel. The noise of the bazaar falls away almost immediately, replaced by the low, steady sound of running water, because the palace grounds are laced with channels and pools fed directly from the qanats, kept flowing day and night for the simple pleasure of the sound and the coolness it carries. Orange trees and jasmine grow along these channels, planted close enough together that their scent overlaps, so that walking the garden paths in the late morning means moving through pockets of orange blossom, then jasmine, then the drier, dustier smell of rose bushes not yet in bloom this late in the season. The buildings themselves seem almost to shimmer. Walls faced in small, hexagonal and rectangular tiles, painted in cobalt, turquoise ochre and white, arranged into patterns of birds, cypress trees, and looping calligraphy that most visitors cannot read, but everyone can admire. Inside, entire halls are lined floor to ceiling, with tiny mirrored glass set at slightly different angles, so a single lamp flame, multiplied across thousands of small reflective facets, can fill an entire room with trembling light. Floors are laid in cool white and grey marble, veined faintly with darker stone, kept so scrupulously clean that bare or stockinged feet are the custom indoors, both out of respect and out of simple comfort, since the marble stays cool even on the hottest days. Beyond the palace's ceremonial halls, past several more gates and a final unremarkable-looking wooden door watched over day and night by an armed attendant, lies a section of the compound reserved entirely for women. This is the andaran, sometimes called by outsiders the harem, though that Western word carries assumptions the Persian one does not quite share. It is not one household, but many, dozens of interconnected courtyards and apartments housing wives, daughters, mothers, and their attendants, each apartment its own small kingdom of rugs and cushions and painted ceilings, connected by covered passageways so that a woman of the court might go days at a time without setting a single sandal on open ground. It is into one apartment within this walled world that we are going tonight. A set of rooms belonging to a young married princess, daughter of a Shah, already 3 years in his grave, wife to a nobleman who is at this moment somewhere else entirely. The morning light is just beginning to touch the upper tiles of her courtyard wall. Somewhere close by, water is already moving through a stone channel, with a sound like quiet conversation. And somewhere inside those rooms, a household is starting, very quietly, to wake. Her full name, by the standards of Qajar royal titles, is considerably longer than the one history eventually settled on. She was born in the palace itself, a daughter of Nasser al-Din Shah, the ruler who held the peacock throne for close to 50 years before his assassination, 5 years before our story opens, shot by a religious agitator while visiting a shrine on the outskirts of the city. Her mother, Turan al-Sultana, was one of the Shah's many wives, and Taj grew up inside the same Andaran walls we have just walked through, one royal daughter among a great many half-brothers and half-sisters, each of them ranked and positioned according to their mother's standing and their father's momentary favor. At 13 years old, in accordance with the marriage customs of her class and her era, Taj was given in marriage to a nobleman named Amir Hossein Khan, a match arranged for political and social reasons that had almost nothing to do with her own wishes, which nobody at the time thought to consult in any serious way. She is 17 now, already the mother of a small daughter, already managing her own household within the palace precincts, a position that would have seemed, from any distance at all, like the very picture of privilege. She has servants. She has silk. She has a household budget most families in the city outside could not imagine spending in a decade. She also has almost no say over the largest decisions of her own life, and this is the contradiction that sits at the center of everything we are about to watch. Taj was one of several daughters born to Nasser al-Din Shah across his long reign, and of her many half-sisters, only 2 remain close to her now that marriage has scattered most of them into other households across the city. One of those 2, a half-sister nearer her own age named Osra, still sends notes occasionally through the same guarded channel that carries everything else, brief, affectionate, careful never to say too much on paper, since a letter passed between 2 royal women can be read by more eyes than the 2 it was addressed to. It is a friendship built almost entirely on scraps. Note here, a rare visit there. And yet it remains one of the steadiest relationships Taj has, precisely because it asks so little of her in the way of performance. Her household, this morning, includes several distinct layers of people, each with their own defined place. There is Nana Khanum, the wet nurse who fed Taj herself as an infant and never fully left her service afterward, now serving as something between a nanny and a confidant for the little daughter as well. There are 2 or 3 younger serving women, responsible for dressing, for meals, for the endless, small errands that keep any household of this size functioning. There is a eunuch, an older man everyone in the household calls simply Aga Bashram, whose job is to guard the boundary between the women's quarters and the rest of the world, escorting messages and approved visitors in and out, a role considered essential to the whole system of seclusion and one occupied across the Qajar court by men whose own lives had been shaped by an entirely separate and often brutal history. Most polite conversation preferred not to examine too closely. And there is, twice a week, a tutor, an older woman, skilled in painting and music, who comes to give Taj lessons in both, one of the only forms of formal instruction available to her at all. It is worth pausing here on the question of appearance, since it is the detail that turned her into an internet joke a century after her death. Court portraits from this period show women whose eyebrows are drawn, thick and nearly joined above the nose, sometimes helped along with kohl, if nature did not oblige on its own. A fashion many modern viewers find startling. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. The joined brow was not an accident of unfortunate genetics presented as glamour. It was a deliberate mark of status, understood at the time, the way a particular cut of dress or a certain jewel might be understood in another century, a signal read instantly by anyone raised inside that visual language. Along with it went a certain fullness of face, a certain solidity and stillness in bearing, qualities associated less with delicacy and more with health, wealth, and the simple fact of never having done a day of manual labor in one's life. Beauty, in other words, was legible information about class, the same way it has always been in every culture that has ever painted a portrait. Ours very much included. Taj, by the standards of her own time and her own court, was considered strikingly beautiful. The joke only works if you refuse to imagine that the people making these choices had any reasons of their own, and they very much did. That tutor matters more than her modest title suggests. Taj is, by the account of nearly everyone who left a record of her, unusually sharp, restlessly curious, hungry for a kind of education the court had no real mechanism for providing to its daughters. She has taught herself to read French well enough to work through a translated novel with a dictionary at her elbow. She keeps hidden among her own belongings several sheets of paper covered in her own private writing, thoughts she has no plan to show anyone, opinions about her marriage, about the other wives in her husband's household, about the entire structure of the world she was born into. Consequences would not be pleasant. This is the humanizing detail we're sitting with for a moment. Not the jewelry, not the title, but the private notebook. A 17-year-old woman, married at 13, already a mother, already fluent in the elaborate etiquette required of her rank, quietly building a second self on paper that nobody else in her household knows exists. It is this second self, decades later, that would eventually become the memoir historians now study the pages that let us stand in this room with her at all tonight. Her daughter, a small, dark-haired girl named Golnar, sleeps most mornings until the household noise finally becomes impossible to sleep through, at which point she appears in doorways still rubbing her eyes, trailing Nani Khanum by one hand. Taj adores her without any complication at all, which is not something she could say honestly about most of the rest of her arranged life. Her marriage to Amir Hussein Khan is by the standards of the court unremarkable, which is to say her husband maintains more than one household, as was entirely ordinary for a man of his rank, and Taj has developed, in private, some sharp opinions about a system that asks women to accept as natural an arrangement no husband would ever be asked to accept in reverse. She does not say this out loud to anyone. She writes it. Later, in the pages nobody is supposed to find. Her own rooms sit at the quiet end of the apartment complex, 3 connected chambers with walls of pale plaster worked into shallow floral relief, a single wall of small mirrored tiles catching the first daylight and scattering it faintly across the ceiling. Thick, hand-knotted rugs in deep reds and blues cover most of the marble floor, and cushions upholstered in worn velvet line the perimeter of the main room. Since furniture in the Western sense, chairs and tables, has only just begun to appear at all in Persian homes of this class, mostly as imported curiosities rather than daily necessities. A low writing desk sits near the single latticed window, and on it, this morning, rests an inkwell, a stack of blank paper, and a reed pen trimmed the night before. It is an unremarkable-looking piece of furniture to have changed, eventually, the historical record of an entire era. A carved wooden chest along one wall holds the bulk of her wardrobe, folded tunics and trousers in shades of deep red, indigo, and saffron yellow, each garment wrapped in a length of plain cotton to protect the embroidery from dust and from the household cat that has more than once attempted to nest among the silk. On top of the chest sits a smaller, lacquered box holding her jewelry, pieces inherited from her mother, alongside a handful acquired since her own marriage, turquoise rings, a pair of pearl drop earrings, a heavy necklace she wears only for the most formal occasions, otherwise keeps wrapped in cloth at the very bottom of the box. Out of both caution and a mild, private dislike of its weight against her collarbone, she knows the contents of that box the way another woman might know the contents of a locked drawer of letters. Not sentimentally exactly, but with the precise, practical awareness of someone who understands these objects as both beauty and, quietly, insurance. Her favorite piece, worn on ordinary days rather than saved for ceremony, is a small turquoise ring given to her by her mother the week of her wedding. Chosen deliberately, her mother told her at the time, because turquoise was believed to darken if its wearer fell ill. A small piece of inherited folk wisdom Taj has never quite decided whether she believes, though she checks the stone's color out of habit most mornings. All the same, her days follow a structure nobody in the household would call a schedule exactly, and yet it has all the rigidity of one. Mornings for prayer, dressing, and the small domestic business of running a household. Midday belongs to obligation, formal calls paid and received among the court's women, each visit governed by rules about who sits where, who speaks first, who must be served tea before anyone else touches their cup. Evenings, when nothing more pressing intervenes, are hers in a way no other part of the day quite is, which is exactly why the evening is when her private writing tends to happen. It is a rhythm built by generations of court women before her, inherited the way a house is inherited, and she has never once been asked whether she finds it comfortable to live inside. Today is by any measure an entirely ordinary day. There is no grand ceremony on the calendar, no wedding, no state visit, nothing that would earn a mention in the court chronicles kept by the palace scribes, which is precisely why it is the right day to spend with her. Remarkable days get written down, ordinary ones almost never do, and it is the ordinary ones that actually made up the overwhelming majority of a life like hers. Her schedule, such as it is, follows a rhythm set less by any written timetable and more by the mechanics of the household itself, the timing of prayers, the movements of the sun across the courtyard, the needs of a small daughter who has no interest whatsoever in anyone else's protocol. One detail is worth holding on to before we follow her into the morning itself. Taj al-Sultana will, within a handful of years, become one of the more remarkable voices to emerge from the entire Qajar court, a woman who eventually supports the constitutional movement that reshapes Persian politics, who argues in her own writing for women's education. None of that has happened yet. On this day, in this year, she is simply a young mother in a walled garden, doing the work of being a princess, while somewhere underneath that work, a much larger transformation is already quietly taking shape inside her. It is not yet fully light when Taj wakes, roused less by any bell or clock than by the muezzin's call drifting over the courtyard walls for the dawn prayer. For a moment, she lies still under a heavy quilted cover, listening to the specific quiet of a house not yet awake, water still moving somewhere outside in its stone channel, a single bird testing its voice in the orange tree below her window. Then Nene Kanom is at the door, as she has been at this same hour for 17 years, carrying a copper basin of water, still faintly warm from the kitchen fire. Washing before prayer is not optional, and Taj performs the ritual ablution with the practiced economy of someone who has done it every morning of her conscious life. Water over hands, over face, over forearms. She kneels afterward on a prayer rug, worked in muted greens and creams, facing the direction fixed for her since childhood, and moves through the familiar sequence of standing, bowing, and prostration that asks nothing of her except attention. It is, she has written elsewhere, one of the only parts of her day that belongs entirely to her, since no servant watches this part, no relative judges it, and for these several minutes, the enormous machinery of court obligation. Dressing takes considerably longer than prayer does. Two of the younger serving women help her into the layers expected of a woman of her rank, beginning with loose cotton undergarments against the skin, then a long tunic called a pirahan, falling to mid-calf, then wide trousers gathered at the ankle, tight enough through the leg to show beneath the tunic's hem in the fashion currently favored at court. Over this goes a short-fitted jacket, heavily embroidered at the cuffs and collar in gold thread that catches even the weak early light. The jacket itself representing, though she rarely thinks about it directly, several weeks of a bizarre embroiderer's labor completed for wages that would not cover a single one of its own sleeves. Her hair is brushed out, oiled lightly, and braided into several thick plaits threaded through with small seed pearls. A hairstyle that will take one of the serving women the better part of 20 minutes to complete correctly. Kohl comes next, applied along the lash line with a slender silver implement designed for exactly this purpose. And here, Taj takes over from her servant entirely, since the precision required is the kind she trusts only her own hand to manage. A faint touch of rouge follows, worked into the cheeks with a fingertip, and finally, her eyebrows are darkened and shaped toward each other with the same kohl, completing the look that marks a woman of her class and her era, one this same face would eventually make famous for entirely the wrong reasons, on screens and in countries that did not exist yet in any form Taj could have imagined. By the time she is fully dressed, the light through the lattice window has turned from grey to a pale gold, and the household beyond her own rooms has fully woken. Breakfast is simple by court standards: flatbread, still warm from the household's own small oven, a soft white cheese, a bowl of dried mulberries and apricots left from the previous autumn's harvest, and tea poured strong and sweet from a samovar that hisses quietly in the corner of the room. Taj eats little, a habit Nani Khanum has commented on for years without ever quite managing to change it, and drinks 2 full glasses of tea in quick succession, the warmth of the glass against her palm. Gulnar appears partway through breakfast, still half asleep. Trailing a scrap of embroidered blanket she refuses to be parted from, and climbs directly into her mother's lap without waiting for an invitation. For several minutes the formal posture Taj has held since waking simply dissolves, replaced by the ordinary business of a mother settling a 3-year-old, wiping a smear of apricot from a small chin, answering a stream of questions about a bird, a dream, her servant's missing shoe, none of which Taj bothers pretending are important. All of which she answers anyway, because this is the one relationship in her life that asks nothing of her except her actual presence. It is 8:15, and the morning has already been full. There is household business to attend to next, the kind that rarely appears in any romantic account of court life, but occupied enormous amounts of a noble woman's actual time. A steward reports on supplies, on a servant's illness, on a minor repair needed to a garden wall damaged by last week's rain. Taj listens, decides, and delegates with the quiet competence of someone who has effectively run a household since the age of 13, a fact rarely acknowledged in any of the paintings made of women like her, which prefer to show idle beauty rather than active management. The truth of harem life, so often imagined as an endless, indolent stretch of lounging on cushions being fed grapes, looked considerably closer, for a woman managing servants, finances, a child, and an elaborate web of social obligation. Only conducted entirely behind walls, most of the population would never see past. Mid-morning brings a visit that has been arranged for several days. One of her husband's female relatives, an older aunt by marriage, whose opinion carries real weight in the family's internal politics. Taj receives her in the main sitting room, cushions arranged according to precise rules of seniority, tea served in a specific order that signals respect without a single word needing to be spoken about it. The conversation moves through pleasantries, health, the weather, a cousin's upcoming engagement, before settling, as these visits so often do, into a gentle but unmistakable inquiry about whether Taj might yet produce a son. She answers with practiced grace, deflecting the question without appearing to deflect it at all, a skill that took years to develop and that she deploys now almost without thinking, though the fatigue of deploying it again this morning sits somewhere just beneath her calm expression the entire time. After the aunt departs, escorted out through the same guarded passage she arrived through, Taj allows herself perhaps 20 minutes near the small courtyard pool outside her rooms, watching light move across the water while Golna chases a moth along the tiled edge. This is the kind of moment that never appears in any court record, unremarkable, uneventful, and entirely hers. She thinks this morning about a French novel she finished the previous week, about a heroine who left her husband's house entirely and built a life of her own choosing, an ending that struck Taj as both thrilling and, for a woman in her own circumstances, almost unbearably distant from anything achievable. She does not dwell on the thought long. There is needlework waiting, a length of silk to be worked into a border for a robe intended for her husband. A task assigned to her, not because anyone doubts the bizarre embroiderers could do it faster and better, but because a wife's own handiwork carries a social value no professional work can replace. She works at the frame for the better part of an hour, seated near the latticed window where the light is best, her needle moving through silk with the same unhurried precision she brings to almost everything, while somewhere in the courtyard a servant beats a rug against a wall in slow, rhythmic thuds. Past several more walls than she can count, the ordinary bizarre noise of the city continues exactly as it has all morning, indifferent to whether anyone inside these gates is listening. Before the tutor's visit, there is time for the household's private hammam, small vaulted bathing chamber at the rear of the apartment, heated by a firebox tended from outside so that the water arrives already warm without any servant needing to carry it basin by basin. Taj visits it perhaps 3 mornings a week, more often in summer, and today is one of those days. Stepping through the low doorway means stepping into a wall of humid heat, entirely different from the dry warmth of the rest of the house. Steam curling up from a shallow marble basin, the air thick with the smell of rosewater and the sharper, cleaner scent of soap made locally from olive oil and ash. One of the serving women works a mixture of ground herbs and clay through Taj's hair, rinsing it afterward with jug after jug of warm water, scented faintly with dried rose petals, while Taj sits with her knees drawn up, eyes closed in the one stretch of her morning that asks absolutely nothing of her posture or her attention at all. Henna is applied to her palms and the soles of her feet perhaps once every couple of weeks, rather than daily, left to darken while she reclines against a marble ledge worn smooth by generations of women doing exactly this. Today is not a henna day, but the ritual around the bath itself, the heat, the steam, the unhurried scrubbing and rinsing, still functions as one of the only times in her week when her body belongs entirely to comfort rather than to display. No kohl, no jewelry, no embroidered jacket. Only warm water, and a comfortable silence that settles over a room built specifically for this single purpose. She emerges, perhaps 40 minutes later, skin flushed, hair wrapped in a length of linen, feeling, for a short while afterward, lighter than the rest of her day will generally allow. The household's own hammam is a private luxury not every family in the city can claim. Many women in Tehran, of more modest means, rely instead on one of the public bathhouses scattered through the neighborhoods, vaulted brick chambers, heated by a shared furnace and divided by hours, certain mornings set aside for women, certain afternoons for men. An entire social institution built quite literally around the scarcity of hot water and private space. For those women, the public hammam serves as marketplace, social club, and information exchange all at once. Gossip and marriage negotiations and news of the wider city pass between neighbors over steam and scrubbing brushes in a way the palace's private arrangement, comfortable as it is, cannot quite replicate. Taj has never once set foot in a public hammam in her life, and it is one of the smaller, stranger costs of her rank that an entire ordinary social world, women meeting as equals over shared water, sits permanently outside her reach. Just before midday, her tutor arrives for the twice-weekly lesson. That is, without exaggeration, the highlight of Taj's week. The woman, a widow of modest background named Khanum Bibi, was engaged years ago to teach painting and music to several of the court's daughters, and of all her students, Taj is by far the most serious about the work, the only one who practices between lessons. Today's lesson is music, the tar brought out from its case and tuned carefully before Taj settles it against her body and begins working through a piece she has been learning for weeks, her fingers still slightly clumsy on the faster passages, but improving, according to Khanum Bibi, at a pace that would be remarkable in a student with far more time to devote to it than a young wife and mother actually has. The lesson lasts the better part of an hour, filling the sitting room with the specific resonant buzz of the tar's strings, a sound that carries faintly out into the courtyard and mixes there with birdsong and running water in a way Taj finds, though she would never say so aloud to anyone but her own private pages, genuinely peaceful than almost anything else in her entire week. Khanum Bibi corrects her posture twice, praises a difficult passage once, and departs promising to bring new sheet music at their next lesson, a small exchange that constitutes in its own quiet way one of the only intellectual friendships available to Taj within the entire structure of her life. There is a brief interruption before the household turns toward midday meals, a message arriving through Aga Baram from her husband's residence across the city, brought by a runner, and passed through the guarded gate the way every piece of communication between Taj and the outside world must pass, filtered, escorted, and observed at every step. The note itself is unremarkable, a brief line about the evening's plans, nothing that would interest anyone reading over her shoulder. What is worth noticing is the process itself, the sheer number of hands and permissions required to move a single folded piece of paper from one side of Tehran to the other, when for a man of equivalent rank, the same message would simply be carried directly, with nobody standing between him and the street outside his own door. By late morning, the sun has climbed high enough that the courtyard has become uncomfortable to sit in directly, and the household, almost without discussion, migrates indoors to rooms kept deliberately cool by thick walls, marble floors, and the simple architectural trick of orienting the main sitting rooms. The contrast is one of the small daily pleasures nobody from outside this world ever seems to mention when they imagine it. Stepping from blinding white heat into a room that feels, by comparison, almost like descending into a cellar, the marble cool enough under bare feet to raise faint gooseflesh for the first several seconds. Taj has grown so used to this daily shift between two entirely different climates, the furnace of the open garden and the cave-like cool of the interior halls, that she barely registers it as remarkable anymore, though she still, on certain mornings, presses her palm flat against the marble simply to feel the temperature difference against her skin. The morning's obligations are not finished yet. Not quite. There is a brief exchange with the head of her small staff of serving women about the day's meals, a matter that sounds trivial and is in practice a genuine exercise of authority, since feeding a household of this size within a fixed monthly allowance requires real calculation, real negotiation with the merchants who supply the kitchen, real decisions about which small luxuries to allow and which to postpone. It is one more piece of invisible labor that the paintings never show, filed away under an image of idle royal ease that has almost nothing to do with the actual mechanics of running a household inside these walls. By the time the sun stands close to directly overhead, and the call to the midday prayer rolls out again across the rooftops, the morning has consumed itself entirely, the way mornings always do. 4 hours and more spent in prayer, dressing, family, obligation, music, and the quiet management of a household that depends on her attention far more than any outside observer would ever guess. She is, if she is honest with herself, in the pages nobody reads, tired already. Now, the economics of this world deserve their own unhurried explanation, because almost nothing we have watched so far means anything without it. Start with the silk itself, since we have already mentioned it twice this morning without pausing over what it actually represents. A length of good quality silk suitable for a court robe, embroidered in gold or silver thread by a skilled bazaar artisan, could take that artisan several weeks of steady work to complete, hunched over a frame for hours at a stretch. That artisan, in an ordinary month, might earn something in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 tomans total, a sum that had to cover rent, food, and whatever family depended on his labor. A single finished court robe, by contrast, might represent a value many multiples of that monthly wage, worn for a handful of occasions by someone who never once considered what those weeks of work had cost the person who produced them. The numbers are worth pausing over a little longer. Her pair of pearl-embroidered slippers, the kind Taj and women of her rank wear as a matter of course, might require a specialist embroiderer working almost exclusively on footwork for the better part of a month, threading tiny freshwater pearls sourced originally from the Persian Gulf Coast into patterns dense enough to catch light from every angle. Multiply that labor across an entire wardrobe, dozens of garments, each one representing a genuine chunk of someone else's working year, and the household budget of a noble family like Taj's begins to look less like simple extravagance and more like an entire small economy, employing dyers, embroiderers, jewelers, and merchants, all in service of maintaining an appearance that the court considered, quite literally, a form of political currency. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it. Appearance, inside a royal court, was never merely vanity. A woman's clothing signaled her husband's status, her father's standing, her family's continued relevance inside a system where influence was constantly being measured, compared, and quietly renegotiated at every gathering, every visit, every formal occasion. To dress plainly was not humility. It was a visible admission of declining fortune, noticed immediately by every other woman in the room. And Taj, whatever her private opinions about the system itself, understood this calculation as fluently as anyone at court, because failing to understand it would have cost her family standing she had no power to rebuild on her own. Meanwhile, just beyond the palace walls, an ordinary bricklayer or porter earned 2 or 3 kerans for a full day's physical labor, 10 kerans making a single toman, and a family in that position budgeted every meal with real anxiety in years when harvests failed or grain prices spiked, which happened with uncomfortable regularity across this period. Bread, the absolute staple of the poorer city, might cost a fraction of a krant per loaf on an ordinary day, but bread prices in Tehran were notoriously unstable, subject to sudden spikes that provoked genuine unrest more than once in the decades surrounding our story, since a hungry city with an enormously wealthy court visible behind its gates has never, in any era, been a stable combination. Much as this distance seemed to separate Taj's household from that reality, the two economies were not actually separate at all. They were the same economy, viewed from opposite ends. The silk on her back, the pearls on her slippers, the gold thread at her cuffs, all of it passed through the hands of people living far closer to that bread anxiety than to her own daily comfort, and the palace's continued appetite for luxury goods was, in its own way, one of the engines keeping an entire section of the bazaar's workforce employed at all. For wages that remained, across the whole period, stubbornly, structurally low. There is more to understand here about how a household like Taj's actually managed its money day to day. Her husband's family maintained a formal allowance for her personal household, dispersed at set intervals, and managed largely by her own stewards rather than by her husband directly, a detail that surprises people who assume women in this system had no independent financial authority whatsoever. Within her own walls, Taj controlled real decisions: servant wages, food purchasing, the timing of major expenses like Gulnar's clothing or an upcoming religious observance. The control simply stopped hard at the boundary of the walls themselves. She could manage a household's money with real skill and real authority. She could not leave the household, choose her own husband, or spend a single toman on an education nobody had decided she was entitled to. That contradiction, a woman trusted with genuine financial competence inside a system that denied her almost every other form of autonomy, sits at the center of nearly everything her later writing would eventually try to explain to a world. To put these numbers in a scale, a modern ear might grasp more easily the entire operating cost of the Qajar court: salaries, food, textiles, ceremonial expenses, and the enormous permanent staff required to run a compound the size of Golestan Palace consumed a share of the national treasury that provincial governors and foreign observers alike complained about constantly. In an empire where the ordinary machinery of tax collection, roads, and public works received a fraction of the same attention. Foreign visitors touring Persia in these decades wrote home astonished at the contrast: palaces glittering with imported French mirrors and Russian crystal standing inside a country where famine could still, in a bad year, kill thousands in the provinces, while the capital's bazaars continued selling saffron and rosewater to a court apparently untouched by any of it. For Taj specifically, this meant growing up entirely fluent in a kind of double vision that most people in her position never fully examined, an awareness, however unspoken, that the comfort surrounding her every single day rested on a foundation. She was not blind to this. Her later writing returns again and again to the servants who tended her, the porters who carried messages for wages that would not have covered one evening's tea service in her own sitting room, the invisible economy of labor that made her cushioned life possible. It would take her years to turn that awareness into anything resembling a public argument, but the noticing itself began early, and it began, in no small part, right here, in the daily arithmetic of silken bread that structured every single day of her life without her ever needing to ask for the numbers directly. She simply lived inside them long enough to feel their shape. Consider, briefly, the household staff we have already met this very morning. Nanik Hanum, having served the family for close to 2 decades, earns a modest but reliable wage supplemented by housing, food, and the kind of long-term security a poor family in the city outside could rarely count on. a genuine trade-off that made positions inside royal service, for all their constraints, actively sought after among the city's working poor. The younger serving women earn considerably less, often sending most of their wages back to families elsewhere in the city or in nearby villages, their labor entirely invisible in any court record, but entirely indispensable to Taj's daily existence, since not one layer of silk would reach her body, not one meal. Without hands belonging to women whose own names appear in no memoir at all, hers included. Akabaham, occupying a role considered essential to the entire structural logic of seclusion, receives a salary reflecting both the sensitivity and, frankly, the personal cost of his position, a cost few at court in this era spent much time reflecting on directly, though it represents worth acknowledging honestly, rather than passing over in polite silence. Jewelry deserves a moment of its own in this accounting, since it functioned as something closer to portable wealth than to simple adornment. Turquoise, mined in the northeast of the country near Nishapur for centuries before this story, and for centuries after it, appears everywhere in Taj's world, set into rings, worked into hair ornaments, inlaid along the handles of mirrors and small boxes, prized partly for its color. Without needing it, explained that a piece of fine turquoise could be sold or pawned in an emergency, the way a modern family might rely on a bank account. Pearls gathered from the Persian Gulf and traded up through Bushehr and Shiraz before ever reaching a Tehran jeweler's workshop, carried a similar dual function, beautiful and liquid at once, a form of savings a woman could wear on her own body and, crucially, 1. She retained some personal claim over even within a legal system that gave her husband authority over nearly everything else she owned. This detail matters more than it first appears to. Because a wife's jewelry was understood by custom, not always by strict law, to belong to her personally rather than to her husband's estate, it functioned as one of the only forms of real financial security available to a woman. Mothers passed jewelry down to daughters specifically with this insurance in mind, a piece of turquoise or a strand of pearls representing not simply beauty, but a kind of quiet, wearable contingency plan, insurance against a husband's death, a divorce, or the arrival of a favored rival within the household. Taj's own jewelry box, sitting on a low shelf in her sleeping chamber, held exactly this kind of calculated inheritance, pieces from her mother, and further back, from a grandmother she never knew, each one a small, glittering hedge against a future nobody in this household ever spoke about directly. Now to the palace itself, to the hour just past midday prayer, when the household's rhythm shifts again, meals are served, visits are paid, and Taj, her morning's obligations, finally behind her, moves into the middle portion of a day that is, in its own quiet way, still just beginning. It is a little past noon, and the household's rhythm changes shape entirely. Midday in the Andaran means the main meal of the day, and the kitchen serving Taj's household has been at work since well before dawn to prepare it. A large brass tray is carried in by two of the serving women and set on a cloth spread directly over the rugs, since dining at a raised table remains, in this era, a foreign custom rather than a Persian one. The centerpiece is kolo, mounded white rice cooked so that a golden crust forms at the bottom of the pot, a delicacy in itself, served alongside skewers of lamb rubbed with saffron and grilled over charcoal just outside the kitchen door. Beside it sits a dish of sabzi, fresh herbs, mint, tarragon, and scallion, bundled together and eaten by hand between bites of rice, and a bowl of yogurt thinned with water, and a pinch of dried mint, cool against the heat of the afternoon. A pitcher of sherbet, sweetened with rosewater and a few threads of saffron, is poured into small glasses, the drink Taj has favored since childhood, and the smell of it, rose and sugar and something faintly floral underneath, is one of the specific smells she will, decades later, associate more strongly with this stage of her life than almost anything else she could name. She eats with Gulnar seated beside her, and for a while, meal is simply a meal. Mother coaxing a reluctant 3-year-old through a few more bites of rice, a shared glass of sherbet passed back and forth, the ordinary warmth of family that exists in this household, exactly as it exists in every other household in the city, royal or otherwise. Underneath all the differences of silk and circumstance, the afternoon proper begins with visits, and today brings 2. The first is a cousin, closer to Taj's own age, married into a different branch of the extended royal family, and their conversation moves easily between court gossip, a disputed inheritance somewhere in the family, and a shared complaint about an aunt whose visits neither of them especially enjoys. There is real affection in this friendship, one of the few relationships in Taj's life not shaped primarily by hierarchy or obligation, and the 2 women talk for the better part of an hour with a warmth that neither would dare display quite so openly in more formal company. A servant brings a plate of sweets partway through their conversation. Noon kameh, delicate rosewater, scented cookies dusted with ground pistachio, alongside a dish of dried mulberries and a small bowl of gaz, the nougat studded with pistachio that travels to the capital from Isfahan. Taj's cousin has a particular fondness for the gaz and makes no secret of it, and the 2 of them go through most of the small plate between them before the conversation has even reached its halfway point, licking sugar from their fingers with none of the careful poise either would maintain in front of the senior lady. It is worth being plain about this because it corrects a real misconception people carry about this world, imagining the Andron as a place empty of genuine intellectual or emotional life, a gilded holding pen for bored women waiting out their days. The reality this afternoon offers a quieter correction. These women read. They discussed politics, carefully and quietly behind closed doors. They formed friendships as complicated and as sustaining as any found outside the walls. And they used what limited tools they had, gossip, alliance, careful word choice, to exercise whatever influence the system allowed them at all. It was a constrained world, certainly, but it was never an empty one, and mistaking constraint for vacancy is one of the more persistent errors made about women's lives across almost every century of recorded history. Not only this one. The second visit is less comfortable. A senior lady of the court, attached to the household of the current Shah, arrives with a small retinue of her own attendants, and the entire tenor of the room shifts the moment she enters. Cushions rearranged, tea poured in a different order. Conversation pitched several degrees more formal than it was even 10 minutes earlier. This woman holds real influence over which families rise and which quietly fade at court. And Taj, watching her own tone soften into something more deferential than she would ever choose naturally, feels the specific familiar fatigue of performing status for an audience that could, with a single unkind word repeated in the right ear, make her family's position measurably worse. It is a taste one recognizes across any hierarchy, in any century. The difference here is only the stakes and how completely those stakes were tied to birth and to marriage, rather than anything Taj herself had ever earned or chosen. Between visits, a peddler is admitted through the guarded gate, one of the few outside women permitted regular access to the Andarun, since men beyond the immediate family are barred entirely, and someone must still bring goods the household cannot produce itself. She carries a bundle of fine cloth from Kashan, several strands of glass beads, and a small mirror in a tin frame that Gulnar becomes instantly and loudly attached to. Taj purchases a length of blue silk for a future robe, negotiating the price with the same careful attention she brings to every other household transaction, and the peddler, before she departs, passes along quietly a piece of city gossip about a merchant's daughter who ran away rather than accept an arranged match. a story that travels through the Andaran by evening, in 3 different versions, none of them quite matching, all of them discussed at considerable length. Before returning indoors, Taj and Gulnar make a short detour through a corner of the grounds not far from her own apartment, a walled enclosure where several peacocks are kept, descendants, according to the older servants, of birds gifted to the court generations earlier and maintained ever since more out of tradition. Gulnar is fascinated by them in the specific fearless way small children are fascinated by anything larger and stranger than themselves. Pressing close to the low fence to watch one male fan out his tail in the early afternoon light, the blue and green of it catching the sun in a way that makes even Taj, who has walked past this enclosure hundreds of times in her life, pause for a moment longer than she intends to. A keeper, an older man who has tended the birds for as long as anyone in the household can remember, offers Gulnar a handful of grain to scatter, which she does with tremendous serious concentration as though the entire success of the afternoon depends on distributing it evenly. It is a small, unremarkable pleasure, the kind that never makes it into any formal account of court life, and yet it constitutes one of the genuine joys available to a child growing up inside these walls, a private menagerie standing in, perfectly enough, for the wider world beyond the gates that Gulnar has not yet realized she is missing. Taj watches her daughter and feels not for the first time a complicated mixture of tenderness and something closer to grief, wondering whether Gulnar will grow up as unaware of the walls around her as most children of this household eventually become, or whether she might inherit some version of her mother's restlessness instead. And if she does, whether that restlessness will find her a kinder world to grow into than the one currently holding both of them. They linger perhaps 15 minutes before a servant arrives to remind Taj, gently, that the afternoon's needlework and the return of her cousin are both waiting, and the small procession, mother, daughter, and the servant sent to fetch them, makes its way back across the garden, past the fountain, past the orange trees now fully in the sun's direct path, and back into the cool of the apartment's main hall. It is well into the afternoon now. The light outside turned harsh and white, the courtyard abandoned entirely in favor of the cool interior rooms. Taj returns to her needlework for a while, the same length of silk from the morning, before setting it aside in favor of the tar, working through the piece Kanom Bibi assigned 2 days earlier, her fingers finding the faster passage a little more easily than they did that morning. Gulnar has fallen asleep on a cushion nearby, one hand still curled around the tin mirror from the peddler's bundle, and for a stretch of maybe 40 minutes, the room holds nothing but the sound of strings and a child's slow breathing and, somewhere beyond the latticed window, water still moving through its stone channel exactly as it has all day. The mid-afternoon prayer arrives, with it a brief pause in which the entire household, servants included, turns toward the same fixed point for a few minutes of shared stillness, one of the only moments in the day when rank temporarily flattens, mistress and servant kneeling on adjacent rugs performing the identical sequence of movements, since prayer, whatever else divides them, asks the same thing of everyone. Afterward, a letter arrives from her husband's household proper, carried, as always, through the same chain of hands, runner to gate to Aga Bahram to Taj herself. Amir Hossein Khan writes rarely, and briefly a few lines about a business matter, an inquiry after Gulnar's health, a note that he will dine at his other household this evening, rather than joining Taj's information, delivered with no more ceremony than a weather report. Taj reads it once, folds it, and sets it aside, without any visible reaction, though the fact that she notices its brevity at all, notices the absence of anything resembling genuine curiosity about her own day. Theirs is not a cruel marriage, by the standards she has been raised to expect. 'Tis simply a distant one, conducted largely through messages relayed by other people, a relationship mediated at almost every point by servants, protocol, and the basic architecture of separate households, and it is one of the quieter costs of this entire system that even a marriage, the relationship meant to define a woman's entire adult existence, so rarely involves anything resembling direct, unmediated conversation between the two people actually inside it. She spends the remainder of the afternoon with her cousin still present, the two of them working through a shared piece of embroidery meant eventually for Gulnar's own trousseau. Years away yet, but already in this world, being prepared for. The conversation drifts, as it often does between the two of them, toward books, since Taj's cousin has also managed, through her own tutor, to acquire a smattering of French, and the two women trade impressions of a translated novel currently circulating in careful secrecy among a handful of literate court women, discussed in a code of careful allusion should any servant happen to be listening a little too closely. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you notice it. A network of women confined behind walls specifically designed to limit their contact with the wider world, nonetheless built for themselves a small, resilient culture of shared reading and shared ideas, passing a foreign novel from hand to hand the way any book club anywhere might. Except that here, the stakes of discovery carried a weight no ordinary reading group has ever had to consider. It is precisely this kind of quiet, persistent intellectual hunger that would, within Taj's own lifetime, help feed a far larger movement for women's education and women's rights across the whole country. Though, this afternoon it looks like nothing more dramatic than two young women trading opinions about a heroine neither of them will ever resemble in circumstance, even if they might resemble her in spirit all the same. By late afternoon, the light beginning to soften and lengthen across the courtyard tiles. The cousin departs, the peddler long gone. The senior lady's visit juiced now to a story that will be discussed and rediscussed for days. Taj sits alone for a few minutes, with the last of the cooling tea. Gulnar still asleep, the household around her settling into the hush that afternoon always seems to bring before the evening's own obligations begin their slow approach. It has been, by any account, a full day already, and it is not yet finished. The detail of that smuggled French novel is one of those moments where the small detail tells a bigger story, and it is worth stepping back from Taj's afternoon entirely to look at the wider structure that made a shared novel feel, in its own quiet way, like a small act of defiance. Education for women inside the Qajar court and across Persian society more broadly in this period was neither universal nor formalized in any way a modern institution would recognize. Sons of the elite received tutors in Arabic, in classical Persian poetry, occasionally in the sciences or in a European language considered useful for eventual government service. Daughters received whatever a father, mother, or grandmother happened to think worth arranging, which varied enormously from household to household, and, within households, from daughter to daughter. Some royal women reached adulthood barely literate. Others, like Taj, developed genuine intellectual range almost entirely through personal persistence, cobbling together an education from whichever tutors happened to be available, whichever books happened to circulate, and whatever hours a demanding domestic schedule left unclaimed. Religion structured the day in a far more uniform way than education did. 5 daily prayers organized the household's rhythm, regardless of rank, and the fasting month of Ramadan, whenever it fell across the solar calendar, reordered meal times, sleep, and social visiting for the entire court simultaneously, mistress and servant alike adjusting together to the same demands. Religious observance was in this sense one of the few genuinely shared experiences crossing every boundary the rest of court life so carefully maintained, a detail that complicates any simple picture of the Andaran, and meaning that structured everyone's inner life regardless of their outer circumstances. Health, however, tells a darker and more uneven story. Persia in this period, including within the walls of the royal court itself, faced infant and child mortality rates that would be considered a catastrophic emergency by any modern standard, common childhood illnesses regularly proving fatal, childbirth itself carrying real and immediate danger for mother and infant both, regardless of rank or wealth. Nasser al-Din Shah, Taj's own father, had employed French-trained physicians for decades specifically because Persian medicine of the period, while sophisticated in certain traditional respects, offered limited defense against the era's major killers. A genuine privilege available to almost nobody else in the country, could not fully close the gap between a royal household's wealth and the basic medical limitations of the entire century. Taj herself, like nearly every mother of her era in every social class, lived with an awareness of child mortality that a modern parent would find almost unbearable, an awareness present quietly underneath even the most ordinary afternoon spent watching Gulnaz sleep on a cushion. Literacy itself remains, across this period, a genuine rarity for Persian women of any class, royal households included. Historians who have studied the surviving records believe only a small fraction of women in Qajar Persia could read or write with any real fluency, concentrated almost entirely among the daughters of wealthy or religiously educated families who happened to have a father, an uncle, or a hired tutor. Taj's own fluency in Persian and, more remarkably, a foreign language she taught herself largely through persistence placed her among a notably small circle even within her own privileged world, a fact that made the poetry gathering and the shared French novel considerably rarer achievements than they might appear from a modern vantage point, where literacy is assumed rather than fought for. There is more to understand here about how seclusion itself functioned, since the popular Western imagination of the harem tends to collapse an entire complex social system into a single image of confinement for its own sake. Seclusion, inside this world, operated the marker of status much as a restriction, since only families of real means could afford to keep their women entirely apart from public commerce and public labor. A poor woman in Tehran walked to the bazaar herself, worked alongside her husband, appeared in public daily out of simple economic necessity, her presence in the street a sign of her family's poverty rather than any special freedom. A woman like Taj, by contrast, demonstrated her family's wealth precisely through her absence from public view, an inversion of the modern instinct that equates visibility with privilege, and one worth sitting with for a moment before assuming any single society's rules about who gets seen in public map neatly onto our own. None of this made the system any less confining for the women living inside it, Taj very much included. It simply means the confinement operated through a logic of status rather than pure deprivation, which is, if anything, a harder thing to challenge, since a woman objecting to seclusion was objecting not to an obvious hardship, but to the very definition of respectability. It would take Taj years of private writing, and eventually years of public involvement in a genuine political movement, to find language for objecting to a system that had been presented to her from birth, not as a cage, but as an honor. Marriage law deserves its own honest mention here, since we have already watched it shape Taj's morning correspondence without naming it directly. A man of Emir Hossein Khan's rank could maintain multiple wives simultaneously, a practice fully sanctioned by both religious law and social custom, and a woman in Taj's position had essentially no legal mechanism to prevent it, object to it in any binding way, or claim equal standing with whichever other household her husband chose to establish. Divorce, where it existed at all as a real possibility, overwhelmingly favored the husband's initiative and the husband's terms, leaving a woman who left an unhappy marriage with drastically reduced social standing and frequently reduced or entirely lost access to her own children. Taj would eventually navigate exactly this reality later in her own life, though this afternoon that future remains hidden from her entirely. One more thing she cannot yet see coming. The broader point, the one Taj's own later writing returns to again and again, is that every individual piece, this system, the marriage law, the seclusion, the uneven education, the layers of guarded messengers standing between a wife and her own husband's household, reinforced every other piece, forming a structure with remarkably few weak points for an individual woman to work against on her own. A clever daughter might win herself an education through sheer persistence. A resourceful wife might manage her household's finances with real skill and real authority. Neither achievement touched the underlying architecture at all. The system had, in effect, built in enough small mercies, tutors here, financial authority there, genuine affection in certain marriages, genuine friendship among the court's women, to make itself bearable for many of the women living inside it, without ever requiring itself to change in any fundamental way. This is, in its own quiet fashion, one of the more sophisticated and durable features of any system built to limit a group of people. It rarely needs to be cruel in every last detail to remain, on the whole, deeply unjust. On the medical side specifically, the physicians attached to the royal household in this period, trained variously in Tehran, in Paris, or in a blend of both traditions, represented the very edge of what 19th century medicine could offer anywhere in the world, which is to say considerably less than a modern reader might assume. Fevers were treated with a mixture of real clinical observation and remedies that a modern physician would recognize as little more than educated guesswork. Childbirth, even attended by the most skilled available help, remained a moment of real danger that no amount of royal privilege could fully neutralize. Taj's own survival to adulthood and Gulnar's survival through her first 3 years both owed something to genuine medical access unavailable to most families in the city, and something else, in equal measure, to simple fortune, a fact every mother in this household, of any rank, understood without ever needing it explained to her directly. Let us return to her household now, to the hour when the afternoon finally begins, loosening its grip, and the evening starts, slowly, to take its place. The heat breaks, as it always does in Tehran, with a suddenness that still surprises Taj even after 17 years of living through the same seasonal pattern. By the time the sun drops behind the western wall of the compound, the temperature falls fast enough to feel almost like a change of season compressed into 20 minutes, and servants move through the apartment lighting oil lamps and small braziers, their flames catching and multiplying across the mirrored wall of the main sitting room until the whole space glows with a warm, unsteady gold, entirely different from the flat white daylight that filled it only hours before. Before dinner, there is a small gathering in a neighboring apartment belonging to another of the court's young married women, an informal evening of poetry that has become, over the past year, a quiet fixture among 4 or 5 of the Andaran's younger residents. 6 women sit on cushions arranged in a loose circle, tea passed hand to hand, while each in turn recites a verse from memory, classical Persian poetry mostly. Hafez and Saadi, learned in childhood and carried ever since the way other people carry a favorite melody, though tonight one of the women, a little bolder than the rest, offers a few lines of her own composition instead, met with genuine careful praise and one gently teasing comment about a rhyme that does not quite land. Calligraphy sheets are passed around as well, practice pages from an ongoing shared exercise in the elegant Nastaliq script, each woman critiquing the other's brushwork with real expertise. Since penmanship of this quality takes years of patient practice and carries its own quiet prestige among women who have few other public arenas in which to display any skill at all. Taj contributes 2 verses from memory and 1 small private observation about a bird she watched that morning, phrased carefully enough that only a listener already familiar with her habits of mind. The gathering breaks up after perhaps 40 minutes, each woman escorted back through her own guarded passage to her own apartment, the evening's warmth lingering a while longer than the gathering itself did. Dinner tonight is quieter than the midday meal, since Amir Hossein Khan's letter has already made clear he will not be joining them. Taj eats with Gulnar and Nani Khanum, a simpler spread than midday's bread. A stew of lamb and dried fruit fragrant with cinnamon and a little saffron. A plate of fresh melon cut into thick slices, the last of the season's crop before the cooler months make it scarce. Gulnar, revived from her afternoon nap, is in a talkative mood, narrating an elaborate story about the tin mirror from the peddler and a bird she is convinced lives inside it, a piece of nonsense Taj indulges completely, laughing in a way she rarely allows herself to. Partway through the meal, Nani Khanum notices a slight rasp in Gulnar's breathing, nothing alarming, the kind of small cough that arrives with the season's first cool evenings, but enough to prompt the household's familiar, unhurried response. A tisane is prepared from dried mint and a little honey, warmed over the kitchen brazier, and brought through still steaming, and Gulnar drinks it obediently, more interested in the honey than in its supposed medicinal purpose. Nana Khanum, who has raised enough children through enough seasonal coughs to have long since stopped feeling any real alarm at this sound, rubs a little warmed oil scented with camphor across the child's chest before bed, a remedy passed down through generations of nursery care with no formal medical backing. Seemed to help. It is worth sitting with this small moment for a second, because it illustrates something true about health in this household that no single statistic quite captures. Even with French-trained physicians theoretically available, should a genuine emergency arise, the actual daily texture of caring for a child's health here looked almost exactly like it did in a poor household 3 streets outside the palace gate. Herbal tisanes, warmed oils. A grandmother's or nurse's accumulated folk knowledge doing the overwhelming majority of the real work. Medicine, in the grander sense, reserved only for the rare moment when something more serious threatened. Wealth bought access to a doctor when the stakes were high. It did not buy any household, royal or otherwise, out of the ordinary unglamorous work of nursing a child through a cough with mint tea and worry, and a hand pressed gently to a small warm forehead every hour or so, until sleep finally came. By the time Gulnar's cough has settled into something closer to an occasional sleepy cough, rather than a real concern, the evening has moved on without anyone in the household treating the moment as anything more dramatic than it actually was, which is, itself, one of the quiet skills of running a household full of small children in an era before reliable medicine, learning exactly which worries deserve a physician and which deserve only mint, tea, a warmed hand. After dinner comes the part of the evening reserved, by long habit, for Gulnar's wind down toward sleep. A bath in a copper basin warmed specially for the purpose, a change into a soft cotton sleeping garment, and a story told from memory rather than read. Since there are almost no books written specifically for children in this era, and mothers simply invent or recite from a shared store of folktales passed down the same way for generations. Tonight's story is one about a clever fox and a foolish lion, told with exaggerated voices that make Gulnar laugh, even as her eyes grow heavier, and by the time the tale reaches its end, she is asleep against her mother's arm, one hand still loosely curled the way it has been since infancy. Nani Khanum carries her to the small adjoining room where she sleeps, and for a moment Taj stands in the doorway simply watching, a private stillness in the evening that belongs to no schedule and no obligation, before turning back toward her own sitting room. It is 9:15. The house is settling into the hush that marks the difference between daytime and evening inside these walls. Servants finishing their last tasks, a final round of tea prepared and left within reach, braziers checked and banked for the night so they will hold their warmth without needing attention again until morning. This is the invisible labor that keeps the household running smoothly through the dark hours. Servants whose names appear nowhere in any account of court life, tending fires and boiling water and folding linens long after the family they serve has retired. Their own exhaustion at the end of a long day entirely unrecorded by anyone, including, if she is honest, Taj herself, who notices it in passing more than she examines it directly. Consider for a moment the 3 serving women finishing their duties in the kitchen. At this same hour, the last one banking, the cooking fire low, the second already asleep on a mat near the pantry, the third slipping quietly out through a rear passage toward the small quarter where household staff sleep. An entire day's worth of invisible labor that made this evening possible for a woman none of them will ever sit across a room from as an equal. From the low window of her sitting room, if she leans just slightly to the left, Taj can see a narrow strip of sky above the courtyard wall, and on a clear night like this one, the first stars are already visible, sharp and close in the thin mountain air. Or, so she has read in translated accounts she only half believes. Somewhere beyond the palace, beyond the city wall itself, the Alborz range holds the last pale light of sunset on its snow line, long after the streets below have gone fully dark, a detail she has noticed every clear evening of her life without ever quite tiring of it. It is worth saying clearly, because this is exactly where the popular picture and the honest one part ways, and it deserves stating before we go any further into the night. From outside these walls, and certainly from 2 centuries of distance, a scene like this one reads as pure romance, oil lamps, poetry, a hidden princess in silk writing by candlelight. Paintings made of similar scenes, both at the time and long afterward, lean hard into exactly that romance, all soft light and languid ease, a fantasy of the Orient built largely for viewers who never once considered what the woman inside the painting. The reality sitting behind that image tonight is a woman managing genuine loneliness, real fatigue, and a carefully hidden frustration with the entire structure of her life. Dressed, yes, in beautiful clothing, surrounded, yes, by beautiful rooms, but experiencing an inner life considerably more complicated than any single brushstroke could ever capture. The romanticized version and the honest version share a setting. They do not share very much else. This is also, most nights, when Taj's real private life begins. She waits until the household noise has fully quieted, until even Nani Kanom's soft movements in the next room have stilled, before drawing the low writing desk closer to the single oil lamp she keeps burning later than any other in the apartment. The inkwell from this morning is still there, the reed pen freshly trimmed the night before. Several sheets of paper already covered in her careful, controlled hand from previous nights, hidden between the leaves of a bound book of poetry where no servant would think to look. Tonight, she writes about the aunt's visit and its pointed question about a son, rendering the exchange with a sharpness she would never allow herself in the room where it actually happened. She writes about her cousin and the smuggled novel, and a feeling she struggles to put into words exactly, something between gratitude for the friendship and grief at how small a space it is forced to exist within. She writes, briefly, about her husband's letter, its 3 indifferent lines, and about a loneliness she has mostly stopped expecting anyone else to notice, let alone address. I want to pause here for a moment because this is the part of the story that rarely gets told, and it deserves more than a passing mention. What Taj is doing, alone by lamplight, after an entire day spent performing exactly the role expected of her, without a single visible crack, is an act that took genuine courage, even though no one around her would have recognized it as courage at the time. She is building, page by page, night by night, a version of herself that answers to nobody's expectations at all. Not her husband's, not her mother-in-law's, not the court's, not even, entirely, her own habits of caution. She has no way of knowing that these pages will survive her, will outlast the palace itself, will eventually be read by strangers on the other side of the world, who never once expected to feel this much tenderness toward a woman who has been dead for the better part of a century. She is simply writing because the alternative, silence complete and total, has become unbearable to her, and because some deeply stubborn part of her insists on being known, even if the only witness available is a stack of paper. Nana Kanome lingers a moment longer than strictly necessary before retiring to her own small room, as she often does, and tonight she asks, in the careful, sideways manner of a woman who has earned the right to ask such things after 17 years of service, whether the mistress is quite well. Taj says that she is, which is not entirely true and not entirely false either. And Nana Kanome, who has watched this specific kind of tiredness settle over Taj's face more than once in recent months, does not press further, only reaches out to smooth a stray piece of hair back from Taj's forehead in a gesture left over from the girl Taj used to be before she was anyone's wife or anyone's mother at all. It is in its own understated way one of the few relationships in the household built on something closer to unconditional affection than to any of the careful hierarchies governing almost everything else, and Taj is quietly, deeply grateful for it, more than she has ever managed to say directly. Outside, the temperature continues to drop, and somewhere past the garden wall, a nightbird calls twice and falls silent. The fountain that has run continuously since dawn keeps running. It sounds slightly different at night, slower somehow, or perhaps it is only that the rest of the world has finally quieted enough to let her actually hear it. Taj writes for the better part of an hour, until her hand cramps and the lamp begins to gutter low on its remaining oil, before folding the pages carefully back into their hiding place, extinguishing the flame, and sits for a moment longer in the dark, listening to a house entirely at rest around her. By the time she finally sets the pen down for the night, the lamp burned down to its last quarter-inch of oil. Taj has filled nearly 2 full pages, more than she managed on most nights this month, and something about tonight's writing leaves her feeling lighter than she has felt since morning. The relief of having said, even only to herself, things she has spent the entire day carefully, not saying to anyone else at all. She reads back over the last few lines once before folding the pages away. A small, private ritual she performs every night without exception, checking her own handwriting the way another woman might check a locked door, confirming that this one thing at least remains fully, entirely hers. It is nearly 11 now, later than she usually allows herself to stay awake, and somewhere beyond her window, the palace has gone almost entirely quiet. Fountains still running, a single dog barking once in the far distance before falling silent again, the last lamp in a neighboring apartment finally extinguished. Tomorrow will bring its own version of today. Prayers and dressing and obligation and needlework, a whole day built from the same materials as this one. And there is something in that repetition Taj finds, depending entirely on her mood in any given week, either deeply comforting or nearly unbearable. Tonight, worn out in the specific way that comes from performing a role all day rather than simply living a life, it leans, just barely, toward comfort. There is a larger story unfolding around her in these very years, one she can only partly sense from inside her own walls, and it deserves its own honest telling before we return to her for the night's final hours. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about what was actually changing underneath this world in 1901. Because it was woven through everything we have watched tonight, even where it does not yet show on the surface of a single ordinary day. The Qajar dynasty, by this point, had ruled Persia for more than a century, but the foundations under that rule were shifting in ways that would have been difficult to see clearly from inside a single household, however observant its residents happened to be. Foreign debt to Russia and Britain was mounting steadily, extracted through a series of concessions and loans that gave both powers outsized influence over Persian policy, trade, and even, in certain notorious instances, direct control over resources as basic as tobacco and later, oil. Ordinary Persians, merchants, and clergy alike watched this creeping foreign influence with mounting resentment, a resentment that would, within just a handful of years of the evening we have spent with Taj, erupt into the constitutional revolution, a genuine mass movement demanding a written constitution, an elected parliament, and real limits on royal power for the first time in the dynasty's entire history. This was not, even by 1901, an entirely new pattern of resistance. A decade earlier, when Taj's own father granted a full national monopoly over tobacco production and sale to a British company, the reaction across Persian society was swift and remarkably unified. Merchants, clergy, and ordinary consumers alike refusing to buy or sell tobacco at all until the concession was withdrawn. A boycott, so effective it reportedly reached even into the Shah's own household, where accounts from the period describe members of the royal family themselves quietly declining to smoke in solidarity, or at minimum out of simple prudence. It was an early, striking demonstration that Persian society, constrained though it was by autocratic rule at the top, retained genuine capacity for coordinated resistance when pushed far enough. A lesson the reform-minded generation coming of age around Taj had studied carefully and would draw on again, more ambitiously, within just a few more years. Technology, in its own quiet way, was already reshaping this world too. Nasir al-Din Shah himself had been a genuine enthusiast of the camera, one of the first rulers anywhere in the region to take up photography seriously, and the palace held, by this point, thousands of glass plate images he and his core photographers had made over several decades, including, among a great many other subjects, informal portraits of women within the royal household itself, images never intended for public circulation but preserved all the same in the palace's own archives. It is a strange thought to sit with that the very same court so careful to keep its women unseen by the wider public had, at the same time, been quietly documenting them on film for its own private record, a contradiction that says a great deal about the difference between seclusion from strangers and simple invisibility. The telegraph line, strung across the country in stages since the 1860s, largely at British and Russian insistence, had already begun compressing distances that once took caravans weeks to cross into a matter of hours. News from Tabriz or Isfahan, or even from London and St. Petersburg, arriving at the palace with a speed that would have been unimaginable to Taj's grandparents. It was this same compressed distance, ironically, that helped the reform ideas circulating through newspapers and pamphlets travel as quickly as they eventually did. The same wires the government relied on to administer its empire also carrying, faster than any censor could fully contain. Nasir al-Din Shah's assassination 5 years before this evening, struck down by a follower of a radical reformist movement while visiting a shrine just outside the city, had already introduced a genuine shock to the assumptions underlying Qajar rule. A violent reminder that the throne's authority was neither sacred nor unassailable in the way official ceremony liked to insist. His son, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, now ruling in his place, and, as it happens, Taj's own half-brother, lacked his father's political instincts and his father's iron grip on the court's competing factions, a weakness that foreign powers and domestic reformers alike would each, in their own very different ways, learn to exploit within the coming decade. Newspapers and printed pamphlets, still a relatively new technology in Persia, were beginning to circulate ideas that would have been unimaginable to discuss openly only a generation earlier. Ideas about representative government, about the rights of ordinary citizens, and, in a smaller but genuinely significant current running alongside the larger movement, about the rights and education of women specifically. The printing press itself, still a recent arrival in Persia compared to Europe, had already begun quietly reshaping who got to participate in political conversation at all. Handwritten manuscripts, copied laboriously one at a time, had for centuries limited the circulation of any idea to whoever happened to have access to the original document and the patience to transcribe it. Printed pamphlets and the first Persian language newspapers, some published from exile in Istanbul or the Caucasus specifically to avoid Qajar censorship, could now reach dozens or hundreds of readers from a single print run smuggled into the country. Careful manner as the French novel currently making its way among Taj's own circle of friends. It is worth noticing how closely these two forms of forbidden reading, political pamphlets moving through merchant networks, and a French novel moving through a princess's poetry circle, actually resembled each other in mechanism, even though nobody at the time would have thought to draw the comparison directly. Both represented the same underlying fact: a growing number of people across Persian society who wanted access to ideas the existing order had never intended to make available to them. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told, alongside the political history of revolutions and constitutions. Women were not spectators to this transformation, watching from behind their walls, while men reshaped the country outside. Taj al-Sultana herself, within a handful of years of this exact evening, would become an active and outspoken supporter of the constitutional cause, using whatever access and standing her royal birth still afforded her to argue in increasingly direct language for an end to the very system of seclusion and unequal education she is living inside on this night. Her later writing would call explicitly for girls' schools, for women's greater freedom of movement, for a fundamental reconsideration of the assumptions that had shaped her entire life up to that point, arguments considered radical within her own social circle and dangerous by more conservative members of her own family. None of that has happened yet. In the autumn of 1901, the constitutional revolution itself is still several years away. The Qajar dynasty has more than 2 decades left before it is finally overthrown entirely, replaced by a new ruling family under Reza Shah, whose own government would, decades later, impose sweeping and often coercive reforms around women's dress and women's public presence, reforms that Taj, by then an older woman living in dramatically reduced circumstances, would witness with feelings considerably more complicated than simple triumph. However far off these changes remain on this evening, they were already, in a sense, present in the room with her. The smuggled French novel, in the poetry circle bold enough to include an original composition alongside the classical canon, in Taj's own private pages arguing, quietly, for a version of womanhood the court around her had never once offered as a real possibility. Historical change rarely arrives as a single dramatic morning. It arrives first as a private thought, considered risky enough to write down only after the household has gone to sleep, repeated in enough private rooms by enough restless women, until eventually, one ordinary year, it stops being private at all. For Taj personally, this meant that the woman writing quietly by lamplight tonight was not merely recording a diary of complaint. She was, without fully knowing it, yet developing the exact voice and the exact arguments she would eventually bring into a public movement, reshaping her entire country. One of the more remarkable and least remembered facts about a life the internet, more than a century later, would reduce to a single joke about her eyebrows. It would be easy and not entirely wrong to want a triumphant ending for the woman writing so carefully by lamplight tonight. The truth her own later life offers is more complicated than triumphant and more human for it. She would live to see much of what she argued for begin, imperfectly, slowly to take shape. Girls' schools opening in Tehran within her own lifetime. A constitutional parliament convened, a public conversation about women's education that would have been unthinkable when she was Gulnar's age. She would also face genuine hardship in her later years, financial difficulty, personal loss, a fall from the privileged circumstances of this evening that she could not, on this night, have possibly imagined. Her memoir itself would sit unread for decades after her death, before scholars finally recognized what they were holding. A first-hand account, rare almost beyond measure, of exactly the private interior life this entire deep dive has been trying to describe from the outside. That her words survived it all, across war, across revolution, across the complete collapse of the very dynasty she was born into, owes something to simple chance and something to her own quiet insistence, night after night, that what she thought and felt was worth writing down even if nobody else would ever read it. Let us return for the final time tonight to the quiet apartment where she is, at this very moment, preparing for bed. Step back, now, all the way back from this single day and this single household, and certain patterns begin to surface. Patterns that reach far beyond 19th century Persia into something closer to a universal shape of constrained lives across history. The first is the sheer density of obligation. From the moment Taj wakes to the moment she finally extinguishes her lamp, almost no portion of her day belongs to her without qualification. Prayer is prescribed. Dressing follows an elaborate expected order. Visits arrive on a schedule she does not control and cannot decline. Even her music lesson, one of the few activities resembling genuine personal pleasure, exists within a structure of permission granted by others. A tutor approved, hours allotted, skills chosen for her rather than by her. We tend, from a distance, to imagine royal life as a life of leisure, empty hours stretching out luxuriously with nothing required of anyone. The reality, watched closely across a single ordinary day, looks almost precisely opposite. A life scheduled down to its smallest gesture, with genuine, unstructured time so scarce that Taj has to steal it, quite literally, from the hours everyone else in the household has agreed to spend asleep. The second pattern is the invisibility of labor. We have met across this single day Nana Khanom, two younger serving women, Aga Bahram, a peddler, a tutor, a cousin's own attendant, a kitchen staff working since before dawn, none of whom appear in any court record, none of whom left behind a memoir anyone would ever study. And yet every single hour of Taj's day depended entirely on their unrecorded work. This is not a pattern unique to Qajar Persia. It is closer to a universal feature of privileged life across nearly every century and every culture. A small circle of visible, remembered lives resting on a much larger foundation of invisible ones. And any honest accounting of a period like this one has to hold both groups in view simultaneously, the princess and the porter. The memoir and the anonymous hands that made the memoir's very existence materially possible. The third pattern is the performance of identity. Nearly everything Taj does today, her dress, her posture during the senior lady's visit, her careful deflection of the question about a son, her tone shifting instinctively depending on exactly who has entered the room, constitutes a kind of continuous, exhausting performance, an identity constructed moment to moment for an audience that is, in some sense, always watching. This, too, reaches well past her own circumstances. Anyone who has ever managed their tone carefully around a difficult relative, or dressed a certain way specifically to be taken seriously at work, understands some fragment of what Taj lived with constantly and completely, though for her, unlike for most of us, the stakes of a single misjudged performance could ripple outward into her entire family's fortunes. The fourth pattern, and perhaps the sharpest one, is the gap between capability and permission. Taj manages a household budget with real skill. She teaches herself a foreign language through sheer persistence. She develops in private a political and social analysis sophisticated enough to eventually help shape a national movement. None of this capability translates into an equivalent measure of freedom. She can run a household. She cannot choose her own husband, end her own marriage on her own terms, or spend a single day outside these walls without permission and escort. This gap between what a person is fully capable of and what a system allows them to actually do is perhaps the single most persistent and quietly devastating pattern running through the entire history of women's lives across nearly every culture. And it is worth noticing how rarely the restriction has anything at all to do with actual demonstrated ability. There is a fifth pattern worth naming as well, one we spent real time with earlier tonight: the economics of appearance. Every stitch of silk, every pearl worked into a slipper, every hour spent perfecting a coal line, functions simultaneously as personal adornment and as a kind of political speech, a constant expensive signaling of status. Taj did not choose this economy of appearance any more than she chose her marriage. She simply lived inside its logic so completely that maintaining it became indistinguishable from simply getting dressed in the morning. One more piece of invisible labor, performed not by servants this time, but by her own hands, on her own body, every single day. The sixth and final pattern is the mediated nature of nearly every relationship in Taj's life. Her marriage travels through messengers and folded letters. Her friendships operate under the constant awareness of a servant who might be listening. Even her bond with her own daughter exists inside a household staffed and structured by other people's labor and other people's rules. Almost nothing in her emotional life happens directly, unfiltered, between two people alone. Everything passes through a third party, a gate, a chaperone, a servant, a protocol. And this mediation, more than the silk or the seclusion, or even the marriage law itself, may be the quietest and most corrosive cost of the entire system. A life lived in genuine intimacy with almost no one, surrounded at every hour by people. It is worth asking, honestly, how much of this has actually changed and how much has simply changed its costume. The specific mechanisms of Taj's confinement, the guarded gate, the veiled seclusion, the arranged marriage at 13, belong clearly and specifically to her own century and her own culture. But density of obligation, invisible labor propping up visible lives, identity performed for an audience, capability outrunning permission, relationships filtered through mediating structures, none of these patterns disappeared when the Qajar dynasty fell or when veils came off, or when women gained the vote in one country after another across the following century. They simply migrated into new forms, new architectures, new kinds of walls that do not always look like walls at all. This is not an argument that nothing has improved. A great deal has, and it would be its own kind of dishonesty to pretend otherwise. It is only an argument that a single ordinary day inside a Qajar princess's household, examined closely enough, tells us something about the shape of constrained lives generally, not only about one century in one country. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told when we talk about lives like Taj's, because it does not fit neatly into either the romantic version or the purely tragic one. She was not simply a victim of her circumstances, passive and crushed. She was an active, thinking, resourceful person, building small pockets of genuine autonomy wherever the system left the smallest crack open. Shared novel, a private page, a friendship conducted in careful code. I think, friend, if you sat with her for even an hour, you would like her considerably more than the meme ever allowed you to. The patterns we have just named describe a system of remarkable constraint. They do not describe a woman without agency inside it. Both things were true simultaneously, and holding both at once, rather than collapsing her into either a symbol of oppression or a symbol of resilience, is probably the most honest thing we can do with a life like hers, or with any life, examined this closely, across any century at all. Taj rises from her writing desk at last, and crosses to the small adjoining chamber, where her own bed waits. A low frame piled with quilted cotton covers, a single remaining lamp already turned low by Nani Khanum before she retired for the night. Through the latticed window, the courtyard sits in near total darkness now, the fountain's sound the only movement left in a world that has otherwise gone completely still. The tile work that glowed so brilliantly turquoise and gold under this morning sun, now reduced to a few pale, uncertain shapes. On the small table, beside her bed, sits the household's running list of tomorrow's obligations, noted in a steward's careful hand. A visit to her mother in the late morning, a fitting for a new winter robe, a message expected from her husband's household regarding an upcoming family gathering. It is in miniature, tomorrow's entire day already sketched out, before today has even fully finished, the same rhythm of prayer and dressing and obligation, and stolen private hours waiting to begin again in barely more than 6 hours' time. There is something almost circular about a life built this way, each day's ending already containing the shape of the day to come, tomorrow beginning, in its own quiet fashion, before tonight has entirely let go of today. Gulnar sleeps soundly in the next room, one small fist still curled the way it has been since she was an infant. Nani Khanum sleeps nearby, her breathing slow, and even after a long day of the same quiet, unrecorded labor she has given this household for 17 years. Somewhere further off, past several more walls than Taj could accurately count, even if asked, Aga Bahram keeps his own late watch over the guarded passage. And beyond him, past the final gate, the city itself has mostly gone to sleep as well. Its bakers already resting before tomorrow's first loaves. Its water carriers finished for the night. Its bazaar shuttered and dark until the muezzin's call brings the whole place stirring back to life in a few short hours. Far beyond the courtyard wall, past the edge of the city, and the last of its earthen ramparts, the Alborz range holds its snow line pale and faint against a sky gone fully dark. The same mountains that watch this exact palace rise and will watch it long after Taj, and everyone she knows tonight has been gone for well over a century. Patient and enormous, keeping whatever quiet watch mountains keep. Inside the apartment, the last embers in the main room's brazier have been banked down to a faint orange glow, enough to keep the chill off the room through the earliest hours of the night without needing to be tended again until dawn. A single cushion still bears the shallow impression of where Gulnar sat during her bedtime story, and Taj's own reed pen lies exactly where she left it beside the now empty inkwell, waiting for tomorrow night's entry the way it has waited, in one form or another, for months. Taj lies back against the cushions, listening to the fountain, to the faint, familiar creak of the house settling in the cooling night air, to nothing else at all. She thinks, briefly, of the pages hidden inside her book of poetry, of the aunt's pointed question, of Khanum Bibi's promised new sheet music, of her cousin and the smuggled novel, neither of them will finish reading for weeks. She thinks, without any special drama attached to the thought, that tomorrow will ask the same things of her that today did, and that she will meet those demands the same way she met today's, carefully, competently, and with a private self folded away where nobody else can reach it. She has no way of knowing, on this night, what will eventually become of the pages she is hiding, or of the country outside her walls, or of the young woman writing them by a nearly spent lamp. She only knows that the writing itself feels necessary, has felt necessary for months now, and that tomorrow, once the household's obligations have run their course again, she will return to it, the way she returns to it almost every single night, adding one more small private page to a record she never expected anyone to read. The lamp gutters once, and goes out on its own before she has even reached to extinguish it. The fountain keeps running in the dark, the way it has run all day, and will run again tomorrow, indifferent to whoever happens to be listening. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, I am glad you spent this evening with her, and with me. There is a whole world like this one, waiting behind nearly every old photograph, every dismissed painting, every joke that travels online, without anyone bothering to ask who the person in the picture actually was. I hope the next time you come across one, you will wonder a little harder about the life underneath it. The lamps in the palace are out now. The fountain is the only voice left awake, murmuring on in the dark, the way it has all day, the way it will again tomorrow. Sleep well, friend. We have spent an evening somewhere real, in a walled garden in Old Tehran, in the company of a young woman who insisted, quietly and for no audience at all, on being known. Let her fountain carry you the rest of the way into your own quiet, and good night.